In the blistering heart of the Arizona desert, a park ranger lay abandoned, hands bound tightly to the base of a weathered tree, lips cracked, throat burning like fire. No radio, no water, not a single sign of life, until the distant sound of hoofbeats echoed across the horizon. What happened next didn't just save his life, it forced an entire nation to reconsider how we treat the wild souls among us. The searing July sun scorched every low-lying shrub across the eastern Arizona desert. Under a sky white-hot and burning like fire, dry winds screamed through endless red rock canyons, whipping up thick layers of dust that scraped across the skin like sandblasted needles. The Red Hollow National Preserve had never been gentle, but for Jack Callahan, its harshness had never been what held him back. Jack, 42, was once a wildland firefighter with Arizona's Rapid Response Unit. He left the force after a devastating wildfire near Flagstaff, a fire that claimed his beloved wife Rachel in a single night of flames and crackling timber. Since that loss, Jed had taken a quieter job as a wilderness coordinator at Red Hollow, less pressure, but closer to the things his heart still longed for: the wild, the silence, and the Mustangs. Wild horses were becoming rare in Arizona. They were driven out, hunted, sold across the border to slaughterhouses. To many, they were just nuisances, wild, stubborn, in the way. But to Jack, every Mustang was a soul, fierce, free, and proud. He called them wind with hooves. That morning, Jack left the patrol station alone to investigate an alert from a motion-triggered camera in the southeastern section of the preserve. The trip was supposed to take no more than 6 hours. But less than 2 hours in, he walked into a trap. He noticed the fresh hoofprints first, clearly not from wild horses. They headed down an old trail that had once been flagged for suspected smuggling activity. Jack moved cautiously, hand on the radio clipped to his shoulder. But before he could call it in, there was a sharp hiss, and then darkness slammed into him from behind. When he came to, his head throbbed like a hammer to the skull. His eyes were blurred by dust and sun. His wrists were bound tightly to the trunk of a tall juniper tree with thick nylon cord. His throat was parched, his cracked lips bleeding. His radio lay smashed on the ground. Nearby, his water bottle had been dumped out, the dark, wet patch quickly vanishing into the stone-hard earth. A large man in a frayed shirt and dusty cowboy hat leaned in close. "You're going to have plenty of time to think about what it costs to stick your nose in other folks' business," he sneered. "By the time someone finds you, the vultures will be done picking you clean." Jack recognized him. Boyd Riggins, suspected leader of a Mustang poaching ring, but never caught in the act. Not out here, not in hundreds of thousands of acres of empty land. By the time Boyd and his crew rode off, leaving Jack tied up under the blistering sun, the desert was already climbing toward noon. From that moment on, there was only isolation, heat, and time, gnawing away at him. The first day passed like a fevered nightmare. Jack screamed for help until his throat shredded. No signal, no one. Night fell fast and merciless. The desert turned from burning to freezing, cold gnawing through his sweat-soaked clothes. He dry-heaved, stomach cramping from dehydration. His head spun. Then came the visions. Rachel, standing just beyond the aloe fronds swaying in the wind. By the second morning, he no longer cried out. He began talking to himself, to the wind, to the shifting shadow of a hawk overhead. "I should have died with her," he whispered. "Maybe that would have hurt less." As the sun rose to its cruelest height, his lips split deeper. He could no longer feel his hands, swollen, bleeding, raw against the binding cord. Each breath rasped like air dragged through broken brick. "If there's anyone out there, God or monster, I'm—" The sentence didn't finish. His throat had dried beyond speech. And then, something else. A sound. Not the wind. Not insects. Hoofbeats. Steady. Many of them. At first, Jack thought it was a hallucination. But then it hit his bones, rhythmic and real, followed by dust rising in the distance from the northwest. A herd. More than 10 horses. Jack's eyes blurred with sweat and tears. But he could still make out the form of the lead stallion, black as coal, gliding like a shadow, a single white streak down its front right leg. "Diablo," he breathed, eyes wide. Diablo, the lead Mustang Jack had once rescued from a steel trap 7 years ago. Back then, he was a defiant young stallion with eyes like cold iron. Jack had freed him, and ever since, he'd catch glimpses of Diablo during patrols, always at a distance, always watching. "It's really you?" Jack gave a pained smile, his lips cracked with dried blood. "If it's really you, help me, just one more time." The wind kicked dust toward Diablo. The herd halted, watching him. Jack shut his eyes, letting his breath slow as if it were his last. But inside something faint flickered. The horses had seen him. And they weren't walking away. They were staying. The desert wind howled on, carrying the sting of scorched earth and cracked cactus. The sky wasn't yet fully bright, but a blood-tinged gold had begun to stretch across the eastern horizon. In the clearing where Jack Callahan's body still slumped against the old juniper, a herd of Mustangs stood in a circle, silent, still, as if they were ghosts born from dust and memory. Jack awoke not to sunlight, but to warmth. A breath, soft and steady, brushed against his cheek. Then another, close to his lips, carrying with it the scent of damp earth, dry grass, and something undeniably alive. His eyelids felt like bricks, but when they parted, the first thing he saw was a pair of deep brown eyes, round, quiet, and curious. It was a mare. Her coat shimmered in a burnished chestnut hue, her mane tousled and her neck strong. She stood no more than 2 hand lengths away. Jack flinched out of instinct, and pain shot through his wrists. The mare didn't startle. She merely tilted her head, then lowered her muzzle closer. From the corner of her mouth, a few cool droplets of water fell onto Jack's lips. Just a few, but for someone who hadn't had a sip in nearly 2 days, it was nothing short of a miracle. Jack gasped, not just from thirst, but disbelief. Thank you, he rasped, his voice like sandpaper dragged over stone. The mare blinked slowly, then backed away a few steps. And then, the black stallion, Diablo, stepped forward. Still regal, still watchful, but this time, he didn't keep his distance. He moved closer, lowered his head, and pressed his muzzle gently to Jack's left wrist, where the bindings bit deepest. He didn't bite, didn't pull, but it was clear he was inspecting. Then, just like the mare, Diablo lowered his head even further. From his mouth, more water droplets trickled onto Jack's lips. Jack thought he might be dreaming, drifting somewhere between delusion and memory. But the cool wetness, the easing sting on his cracked lips, it was real. It was undeniable. It was a miracle. And it continued. A pale gray Mustang stepped in next. Then a roan. One by one, without urgency, without hesitation, each horse approached, leaving behind a few precious drops after drinking from some hidden spring nearby, then stepped back, quiet as whispers. Jack didn't move. Tears welled up, burning. His body still felt like stone, but inside something stirred. Not life, something deeper. A flicker of connection. Something he thought he'd buried with Rachel in the fire. Night returned slowly. The desert air turned cold, sharp through the damp cloth clinging to his back. Jack trembled uncontrollably. His hands had gone numb. His thoughts swirled into delirium. He was certain he wouldn't survive a second night. But this time, he wasn't alone. A movement to his left made him crack one eye open. The same chestnut mare, the one who had given him water first, was approaching slowly. Without a sound, she lay down beside him, pressing the warmth of her flank against his shivering back. Jack couldn't believe it. Her breathing was slow and steady, like a lullaby. Her body heat seeped through his damp clothes, through skin and muscle, down to the marrow of his bones. And then, 2 young colts lay down on his other side, closing the circle. A living ring of warmth and protection in a place of death. Jack said nothing. He closed his eyes, letting silent tears trace down sun-hardened cheeks. In his mind, Rachel's face appeared, smiling softly through a mist of memory. And for the first time in 5 years, Jack whispered a truth he had never dared speak. "I'm sorry, Rachel, for living without the courage you had, but tonight, someone found me. Maybe you sent them." The mare's breathing remained steady. Jack named her in his mind Sage, for the wild herb scent that clung to her mane, the smell of the land he loved. None of them left. And in the drifting half-sleep that followed, the first rest he'd tasted in days, there were no nightmares, only light. Only a dream of galloping across wide-open plains, and leading the way, those same brown eyes glowing like beacons. Off in the distance, dawn was breaking. Morning arrived with a pale, reverent stillness, as if the desert itself had paused to hold its breath. Jack Callahan woke surrounded by warm bodies, their steady breathing like a living dream. When he opened his eyes, Sage was still beside him, her head gently tilted toward him, waiting for a sign. The rest of the herd had risen, slowly moving toward a patch of dry brush where tufts of brittle grass poked through cracked soil. Jack felt heavy, his body leaden and raw, but the pain in his wrists had dulled. What swelled in his chest now wasn't hope or safety. It was something stranger. The feeling of being seen, of being recognized, not by people but by something far older, more primal. He turned his face toward the breeze. It carried the scent of damp earth and something else, something ancient, the scent of memory. He remembered clearly the first time he met Diablo. It was during the second winter after Rachel's death. He had just been transferred to Red Hollow and was still learning to adjust to the solitude of life on the fringe. During a patrol tracking wild Mustangs, Jack found a young black stallion caught in a rusted steel trap, the kind poachers used to capture Mustangs and sell them across the border. The horse didn't scream or thrash. It simply lay there, blood oozing from its front leg, its eyes wide open. When Jack approached, the stallion stared at him with a look that stopped him cold. Rage, pain, and pride. It took Jack nearly 3 hours to free him. His hands were bloodied by the steel, but he didn't stop. He spoke the whole time like he used to speak to Rachel. "You're not dying today. I've lost enough already." Finally, the trap came loose. The horse staggered to its feet. But he didn't bolt. He stood there, locking eyes with Jack for a few heartbeats, longer than any human ever had since Rachel. Then he turned and vanished into a wall of dust. Jack had named him Diablo, not because he was vicious, but because he was too beautiful, too untamed, too much like a forgotten spirit of the wild. And now, Diablo was here again, not as a rescued animal, but as a leader, as a brother. By mid-morning, Jack noticed something strange. Diablo stepped away from the group, let out 3 short, sharp calls like blades through air. Instantly, the herd stirred. 2 young Mustangs, a gray and a reddish-brown, lifted their heads, ears perked, alert. Jack narrowed his eyes. Years of experience in fire rescue and wildlife observation had taught him this wasn't random behavior. It was a signal. Diablo turned to look at Jack. His eyes, once wild, now held something more. Intention. A message. He called out again, softer. The 2 young colts broke from the herd, galloping west toward the auxiliary ranger station of Red Hollow, nearly 12 miles away through rocky terrain. Jack could hardly believe what he was seeing. No, that's not possible. But the scene before him was undeniable. Hooves struck the cracked earth, throwing up dust in their wake. Those colts weren't just running, they were going for help. Jack breathed hard, not just from exhaustion, but from something else rising inside him. Belief. Time crawled like sand through a clenched fist. Noon came. The sun blazed. Sweat dried on Jack's forehead. His body began to tremble from fever and dehydration. Sage never left his side. The chestnut mare still stood nearby, occasionally lowering her head to lick his wrist, where the cord bit deepest. But now, something else happened. Diablo stepped in closer. Jack could feel the stallion's breath against his face. Those dark eyes held his, unwavering. Then, Diablo lowered his head and gently bit at the nylon rope around Jack's back. The harsh sounds of scraping filled the air. He tugged, shifted, tried different angles. It wasn't working at first. But then, with a final jerk, the rope loosened just slightly, enough to ease the pressure on Jack's swollen joints. Jack wept, silently, but the tears fell onto cracked skin into desert dust. "You're trying to save me," he whispered. "You remember me, don't you, Diablo? I never forgot you." Night fell once more. No one knew if the colts would reach the station. No one knew if the poachers would return. But in the heart of the desert, where life clings by instinct alone, something extraordinary was unfolding. Jack Callahan, a man who had chosen isolation over healing, was being cradled by wild horses. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel abandoned anymore. Morning winds swept across the western edge of Red Hollow Preserve, stirring fine sand from the sunburnt red rocks. Narrow trails curled along hillsides where gravel crunched beneath hoofbeats. This time, not with wandering ease, but urgency. 2 young Mustangs, one pale gray, the other a fiery chestnut, charged forward as if driven by something deeper than instinct. Their wild nature wasn't erased, but overtaken by something greater: purpose. River, the gray colt, was smaller but steady. Dust, the chestnut, was quick, agile. Together they sprinted across ridgelines, down dried creek beds, weaving through pine woods and narrow valleys, without stopping, without fear. They didn't know the exact place they were going, But something in their bones told them, a human needs saving. One who had been accepted as part of the herd. And when Diablo called, none of them had hesitated. At Red Hollow's auxiliary ranger station, nestled below a towering red cliff, Marcy Quinn was reviewing motion camera feeds when she spotted something strange. A pair of wild Mustangs was approaching the northern fence line. It wasn't rare for Mustangs to roam near the station, but today, something was off. They weren't skittish. They weren't cautious. They didn't act like prey. They walked straight toward the fence, eyes focused, ears perked, breathing hard. Marcy frowned. She'd only been stationed here for 3 weeks, still learning to read the line between wild behavior and warning signs. But this didn't feel random. It felt deliberate. "Thomas," she called out. From the back room emerged a tall, weathered man with silver hair, sun-darkened skin, and the sharp eyes of someone more at home in the wild than among people. Thomas Yates, keeper of the camera system and an elder of the local Tohono O'odham tribe. He was Red Hollow. He looked out the window. For a few moments he said nothing, just watched. "That's unusual," he murmured. "They're not here to graze, no foals with them, and this isn't their usual territory." "Then why are they here?" Marcy asked. Thomas turned to her slowly and said, "Because they're calling out." River and Dust didn't stop at the fence. They ran along it, kicked up dust, then turned back, glanced at the humans, then galloped again. "Run, look back, repeat." Marcy unlocked the gate. The moment it opened, the colts bolted a few hundred feet, then stopped, looked back again. "They want us to follow," she said with certainty. Thomas nodded. He grabbed a handheld GPS and activated a tracker, one of several tagged Mustangs from 2 years ago. "Got a signal," he said. "Dust, male, 2 years old, tagged last spring. He was still nursing when we chipped him." Marcy didn't wait. She jumped into the 4-wheel Ranger vehicle. Thomas climbed into the passenger seat. Together, they followed the colts across one of the harshest terrains in Red Hollow. Driving wasn't easy here. But every time they veered off, River would slow down and steer them back, like a living map. Thomas remained silent for nearly the entire first hour, but his eyes grew sharper. He knew this wasn't chance. Meanwhile, at the main station, a disturbance showed up on the central feed, interference near Jack Callahan's patrol zone from 2 days earlier. Station Supervisor Harry Connor, a veteran and once Jack's longtime colleague, immediately filed an alert into the control system. "Jack is missing. No report, no radio contact. Mustangs leading us somewhere. I suspect a critical incident." The command center's response was swift. "Deploy rescue team immediately." Back in the field, Marcy and Thomas lost the GPS signal as the terrain grew too rough. They reached a clearing, thin trees, jagged rocks. River and Dust climbed effortlessly. Thomas raised a thermal monocular, a modified device he'd built himself. On the screen, a single red blip glowed faintly in the cold gray of the rocks. "There's someone there," he said quietly. Marcy floored the pedal. She no longer needed the horses to guide her. But they still ran ahead, swift and silent. When the sight came into view, Thomas whispered, "Dear God, it's Jack." About 100 meters ahead, Jack Callahan sat slumped against a massive tree. His head tilted, wrists swollen, his face pale and bloodied. Around him stood the herd. They didn't flee. They didn't retreat. They stood like sentinels, alive, unmoving, guarding a soul the world had forgotten. Marcy hit the brakes and jumped from the vehicle. She rushed forward, but Diablo stepped between her and Jack. Thomas called out softly, "Stop." They froze. Diablo looked straight at Marcy. This wasn't the gaze of an animal. It was the look of a leader. One delivering a condition. "You may approach, but only with respect." Marcy bowed her head, took one step back. Diablo studied her, then stepped aside. The path was open. She ran to Jack and dropped to her knees. "Jack, it's me, Marcy. Can you hear me?" Jack whispered, barely audible but clear. "I told you they wouldn't leave." Marcy turned her head. The herd remained, still watching, still standing, still guarding. No one spoke as Marcy gently placed a hand on Jack Callahan's shoulder. The Mustangs still stood in their silent circle, forming what felt less like a herd and more like a sacred shield. Every eye remained fixed on Jack, not with fear, not with aggression, but with a stillness that felt like reverence. Jack opened his eyes again, and this time the fever glaze was gone. A faint shimmer lit them, something soft, something like peace. "Sage," he whispered. Marcy glanced around. "Who's Sage?" Thomas, now kneeling beside Jack, checking his vitals, murmured, "He's naming her. The mare, the one with the dark chestnut coat on his left. I think she's been with him this whole time." Marcy nodded, a lump catching in her throat. Her heart thudded. Her eyes stung, but she couldn't tell if it was the desert dust or the raw truth of what stood before her. Too real. Too beautiful. Too much. Engines roared in the distance. The main rescue team had arrived, nearly 2 hours behind schedule due to the brutal terrain and lack of precise coordinates. But when they rolled in, what they saw left them silent. The Mustangs didn't flee. Normally, just the sound of an engine would send wild horses sprinting to the horizon. But not these. They stood their ground, each one facing forward, ears turned as if they understood. It was over now. Diablo stepped forward, lifting his head and bowing slightly toward Jack. Marcy shivered. "Are you recording this?" she asked, voice trembling. Thomas lifted the handheld camera. He'd started filming when River and Dust first appeared. Now, he captured the full image. A herd of wild Mustangs encircling a broken man, protecting him, not fleeing from the chaos of trucks, voices, or tools. As the rescue team exited their vehicles, some moved quickly toward Jack, but Marcy raised a hand. Slowly, one step at a time. She knelt beside him, pulling out a small knife to carefully cut the remaining cord around his wrists. The skin was blistered and bleeding. She moved gently, but Jack still flinched as the last knot slipped free. "I know," she whispered. "I know it hurts, but we've got you now." Jack nodded faintly. "Don't make them leave." Marcy looked at the herd. "No one's touching them." Jack's voice was faint but clear. "I saved Diablo long ago." Maybe, he remembered. Thomas placed a firm hand on Jack's shoulder. He didn't just remember, he repaid a debt. As the off-road ambulance revved to life, the horses stepped back, not in panic but in purpose. They parted slowly, forming a narrow path as if creating a ceremonial exit. Jack was lifted into the vehicle. Just before the doors closed, he turned his head, searching for Sage. She stood there just beyond the yellow grass. Their eyes met. She dipped her head slightly and with a soft exhale, sent one final breath toward him. Jack raised his good hand, just barely, and waved. The door closed, but something inside him had opened wide. 2 days later, the footage Thomas captured was uploaded to the Arizona Wildlife Preservation Network's official page. Within 24 hours, it had over 2 million views. The images stunned viewers. A man, tied and dying in the desert, a herd of wild horses surrounding him, giving him water, warming his body, guarding him, and finally, calling for help. "They don't do that," one user commented, "unless they know." "This changed everything I thought I knew about wild animals," another wrote. "I didn't believe in miracles. Then I watched Mustangs stand their ground, even as the rescue team arrived." The nation took notice. Major news networks aired the clip, scientists debated, lawmakers began to listen. But for Jack Callahan, only one thing mattered. He was alive. At Flagstaff Medical Center, Jack lay quietly in recovery, staring through the window at a small desert garden bathed in sunlight. Marcy sat beside him, coffee in hand, reading a folder of paperwork. "When can I leave?" Jack asked. His voice had regained strength. 3 more days, Marcy answered. "But it'll be weeks before you're fully back on your feet." Jack nodded. "I don't plan on staying here long." "Where are you going?" He was silent for a moment, then said, "Back to Red Hollow." Marcy smiled. "They're waiting for you, and I don't mean the people." That afternoon, Jack stepped onto the hospital balcony, breathing in the pine-sweet air of Arizona. Somewhere out there, beyond the hills and dry plains, were Sage and Diablo. He didn't know if they would remember. But he knew this much. He owed them something greater than his life. Not for saving him, but for showing him that even when a man has lost faith in himself, there are wild souls out there who never gave up on him. 2 months after the rescue, Jack Callahan returned to Red Hollow. The scars on his left wrist hadn't faded, and every time he ran his fingers across the raised, rough skin, a sharp ache returned. Not from pain, but from memory. He remembered lying helpless in the desert, convinced that his story had ended. He remembered how wild creatures, supposedly incapable of compassion, had kept him alive through breath, through precious drops of water, through a sacred silence that shielded him from death. Marcy stood on the wooden steps of the ranger station, hands on her hips, her expression a mix of sternness and mischief. "You still look pale, Callahan," she said. "You sure you're ready to come back?" Jack laughed. I'm not sure about me, but I think there's someone still waiting. From the valley below came the unmistakable rhythm of hooves. Then, like a vision conjured from memory, Diablo emerged from the tree line. Behind him, the herd materialized one by one, bold and unbroken. Sage stood in the middle. Her belly, now round with life, swayed gently with each step. She walked to the front, lifted her head, and released a long, quiet breath, like an exhale of recognition. Jack couldn't hold back the tears. Inside the temporary headquarters of the Red Hollow Station, Jack, Marcy, and Thomas gathered around a table covered in maps, documents, and printed camera stills. Echo Wild Initiative, Marcy said, dropping a thick folder onto the desk. Thomas came up with the name. It's about the dialogue between humans and the wild. Or, Thomas added, like the echo of nature we stopped listening to. Jack nodded. I like it. The project aimed to track communication behaviors between the Red Hollow Mustangs and their environment, especially their interactions with humans. Thomas managed the motion sensor camera network. Marcy handled data and legal logistics. And Jack, the survivor, became the field lead. Data from dozens of trackers along the herd's migration path showed unique behavior patterns not seen in other wild Mustangs, approaching humans, remaining calm around loud noises, and most shocking, actively guiding humans out of danger. I don't think this is coincidence, Marcy said. In the past 3 weeks, we've had 2 locals get lost near rockfall zones. Both were guided out by Mustangs. One of them was an elderly man gathering herbs with a sprained ankle. He said, quote, "The horse waited for me, then kept walking like it wanted me to follow." Thomas crossed his arms, voice low. In my tribe, we've always believed that Mustangs aren't just free spirits. They're boundary keepers, between us and the wild. Maybe they're reclaiming the space we stopped hearing. But not everyone was willing to listen. At the Arizona Wildlife Conservation Council's October session, Senator Raymond Brooks stepped up to the podium, voice sharp and cold. We're spending millions every year protecting an unprofitable species, he said. They damage vegetation, compete with cattle for water, and now you're proposing to expand their protected range? This is absurd. Jack sat in the audience, silent, eyes steady. Marcy drew a breath. Thomas scribbled quietly in his notebook. When Jack's name was called, he stood up. No notes, just a coil of worn rope, the same cord that once bound him to a tree in the desert. I won't speak about emotions, Jack began, voice calm and firm. Just one truth. If it weren't for that herd, I'd be dead. The room fell silent. They weren't just horses. They were witnesses, memory keepers, and in the past few weeks, they've saved 3 more lives. Not 1, 3. He held up photos, Sage licking an elderly man's cheek, River and Dust leading the rescue team, and a short clip, Diablo rearing, then leading the herd down a mountainside as if completing a mission. I'm not asking you to believe me, but if you won't believe your own eyes, look here. He nodded to Thomas. The screen lit up, a map overlay showing the herd's paths aligned with seismic activity. The Mustangs had moved out of danger zones 24 hours before the events. They also led campers out, right along the same paths. Marcy stood. We propose halting all reductions to protected areas. Instead, we request the creation of a dedicated sanctuary and cognitive study zone for wild equine communication. Senator Brooks said nothing, but he lowered his head. 3 days later, the state government approved the founding of the Red Hollow Mustang Communication Research Project, the first in U.S. history to formally recognize intentional, purposeful interaction between wild horses and humans. Jack, Marcy, and Thomas became the project's core team, and the Mustangs never left. Sage gave birth just before dawn on a crisp November morning, a full, bright-eyed, with a single silver streak slashing across its forehead like a scar. Jack stood at a respectful distance watching. Sage turned, nudged the foal gently toward him. She's handing him over, Thomas whispered. Jack didn't speak. He knelt, gently touched the foal's forehead. Welcome to the world, Lumen, he said softly. Lumen, a name that meant light, because even in a world scorched by doubt, where belief had long burned out, a miracle could still be born from a stallion's cry in the desert. 1 year after Jack Callahan nearly died in the desert, the Echo Ridge Mustang Sanctuary was officially opened. The ceremony took place in the gentle chill of a November morning. The sun had just risen over the eastern peaks, its golden rays spilling across the open plains like a silk ribbon. The American flag fluttered above the wooden gate, carved with the name Echo Ridge Mustang Sanctuary, a place once forgotten, now reborn. It became the first sanctuary in the United States not only to protect wild Mustangs, but to formally study their communication with humans. Jack stood beside Marcy and Thomas, dressed in a crisp white shirt, an old brown cowboy hat, and a thin wine-colored scarf. Rachel's birthday gift from years ago. His heart beat slow but steady, like hoofbeats echoing through a lifetime. "You ready?" Marcy asked, voice as soft as the wind. Jack nodded. "I'm always ready, when I hear them coming." From the end of the dusty road, a quiet rumble grew louder. 4 buses pulled up, carrying over 100 elementary school children from nearby Flagstaff. The Mustang Education Program, funded 6 months earlier by the state, had chosen Echo Ridge as its first immersive learning destination. "Don't forget your speech," Thomas teased, smiling. "I won't say much," Jack replied. "Today, I'll let them speak." The children spilled out onto the viewing platform, eyes wide as they took in the rolling fields, soft hills, and far off under the sun's glow, those majestic shapes. Horses, not in stalls, not tied down, not broken. They stood in small clusters, roaming free. Every movement held distance, rhythm, and calm like an ancient rite. Then, from behind a low ridge, a familiar figure emerged. Diablo, tall, dark, his black mane catching the breeze. He walked slowly, each hoofstep landing with the weight of ceremony. Behind him came Sage, and beside her Lumen, now taller, healthy, full of life, stepping confidently into the world. The children hushed. "He's looking at us," one whispered. "I thought wild horses didn't come close to people," said another. Diablo stopped 20 paces from the crowd. No one moved, no one spoke. And then he bowed his head, slowly, deliberately, with a presence that transcended language. Jack swallowed hard. He wasn't sure if the children understood what that gesture meant, but to him it meant everything: recognition, acceptance, forgiveness. By midday, Jack led the students toward Nursery Hollow, a natural enclosure formed by thick grass and low stone, where mares cared for their young. It was the only place in the state where wild horses allowed humans to observe them this closely. Aurora, a newer mare, approached the children without fear. When one boy reached out, she didn't bolt. She stepped back a pace and held her ground. That stillness tightened the teacher's throat. "They're not trained to do this," Marcy told the group. "No handlers, no ropes, no force, they choose." That line, quoted from Jack's opening speech, was later etched into the sanctuary's main signpost. As afternoon light deepened, Senator Ray Morrison arrived. Once the fiercest opponent of the Echo Ridge Initiative, he had changed after watching the footage of Diablo protecting Jack. Now he stood in the field, leaning on his cane, gazing toward Sage and Lumen. "You were right," he told Jack. "We're not protecting them. They're teaching us how to live." Jack smiled faintly. "I was just lucky enough to survive and see it. And to tell it." Ray nodded once solemnly. The event ended with no pomp, no music. Just wine brushing through the tall grass, golden light spreading across the land, and the herd forming a half-moon before the guests, Diablo and Sage at the center, like ancient guardians. Jack stepped onto a small wooden platform. No script, no paper. "I used to think I was the one protecting the wild Mustangs," he said. "But now, I believe they've been protecting us. Humans who lost our way in ambition and loneliness." In the distance, Diablo lifted his head, his gaze finding Jack's. That same look, unyielding, wild, now held something else. Gentleness. "They don't need us," Jack continued, "but they chose to stay." The wind picked up. Diablo climbed the slope behind the sanctuary, the highest point in Echo Ridge. He stood there, his silhouette striking against the burning sky, mane flying like smoke. Behind him, the herd moved as one, quiet and composed, like a wordless song. Children waved. A little girl whispered, "What's his name?" Jack answered, "That's Diablo. He is the witness to freedom." That night, as darkness fell over Echo Ridge, soft lights from the research station glowed across the hills. Jack sat alone beneath the old juniper tree, the very one he'd once been tied to, stranded between death and dust. Now it stood as the heart of the sanctuary. He closed his eyes, breathed deep. From afar, a low whinny rose on the wind. Not a warning, not a cry, just a whisper from a soul passing through the night. Jack opened his eyes and looked up the ridge. Diablo had returned. He stood still, gazing down. No movement, no sound, and it was enough, more than enough to know. That bond, that friendship, that legacy of freedom would live on. If you believe that even in the harshest desert, compassion can come from creatures that don't speak, drop a 1 below. If you've ever witnessed a moment that made you believe nature understands us more than we realize, comment a 0. And if the story of Jack and the Mustang herd stirred something in your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, so you won't miss the next extraordinary journey, where love, life, and freedom are told through the eyes of America's wildest souls.